The room was tense, heavy with the weight of a hearing that had already stretched too long. Cameras clicked in the background, lenses waiting to capture a soundbite that would ricochet across the nation. At the center of it all sat Senator Ted Cruz, leaning forward in his chair, brows knitted in that practiced scowl he'd perfected over years of Washington theater. His voice cut through the chamber like a blade, loud, unyielding, interrupting mid-sentence with the force of someone who had long grown accustomed to dominating the floor. Across from him, Representative Jasmine Crockett adjusted her microphone, lips parting to continue her thought. But no sooner had she begun than Cruz's voice rose again, sharp and relentless. That was the first interruption. She exhaled slowly, eyes steady, waiting for him to burn through his theatrics. He leaned back, satisfied, only for her to reclaim the floor. The second interruption came faster, more aggressive. His words weren't aimed at seeking truth but at seizing control. Viewers at home could sense it. The power play, the bullying cadence of a man who believed volume equaled victory, yet Crockett's composure held, her silence louder than his bluster. A third time, then a fourth. By the fifth interruption, murmurs rippled through the room. Staffers shifted in their seats, side-eyes exchanged. The chair of the committee tapped the gavel lightly, but Cruz plowed forward, ignoring even the procedural warnings. He thrived on disruption, on drowning out dissent. 6 interruptions in, and still Crockett refused to snap, her gaze fixed like steel, her patience deliberate. This wasn't just a clash of personalities. This was the old guard testing the resolve of a rising voice. Cruz embodied the entitlement of politics as performance. Crockett represented the persistence of those who had fought to be heard in spaces not built for them. The tension in the room was palpable, a string pulled tighter with each verbal strike. And then it happened. The seventh time Cruz leaned in, cutting her off before her sentence found its rhythm, something shifted. Crockett's eyes sharpened, her chin lifted, and the silence that followed was heavier than his interruption. What she said next would not just stop Cruz in his tracks. It would ripple far beyond the hearing room, a single line that turned arrogance into humiliation and silence into triumph. And it all began here in this moment, when the chamber braced itself for history. What unfolded in that chamber was never just about one senator and one representative sparring over parliamentary procedure. Beneath the sharp exchanges lay a larger battle for visibility, respect, and the very meaning of leadership in America. To understand why this moment carried such weight, you have to see it not as a fleeting clash, but as a mirror held up to the country itself. On one side sat Ted Cruz, polished in the art of political performance, wielding interruption as both shield and sword. For years he had made himself a symbol of bluster, the embodiment of an old-school politics that rewards domination over dialogue. For Cruz, the committee wasn't about truth. It was a stage, and he wanted the spotlight fixed solely on him. On the other side was Jasmine Crockett, a woman whose journey into Congress was forged through grit, persistence, and a refusal to accept silence as the default. For her, this wasn't about performance, it was about principle. Every time Cruz spoke over her, he wasn't just interrupting a congresswoman, he was interrupting the voices of those she carried into that room. Immigrants, working families, communities too often brushed aside in policy debates. Each cutoff was more than a tactic. It was an insult to those whose stories rarely make headlines. The stakes stretched further than the hearing itself. To the millions watching clips online, this confrontation wasn't a policy footnote. It was a symbol of how power works in America. When the powerful interrupt, when the loud drown out the measured, the entire nation sees the imbalance. Viewers felt it in their bones because they had lived it, in workplaces where their ideas were stolen, in classrooms where their hands were passed over, in daily conversations where dignity was dismissed. Cruz's interruptions were not only meant to destabilize Crockett, they were meant to remind her of hierarchy, of seniority, of who had been allowed to dominate the halls of power for generations. But what he underestimated was that Crockett wasn't entering this exchange to simply defend herself. She was entering it to make a statement that the future no longer bends to the arrogance of the past. The hearing room had become a stage for something larger, the clash between a politics that silences and a politics that empowers. Every second of Cruz's interruptions added fuel to the fire, setting the audience on edge, daring them to wait for the moment when patience would snap and resistance would take form. People watching at home leaned closer, waiting. They knew Crockett's silence wasn't submission, it was strategy, the calm before the storm. Each time she inhaled and let him finish his interruption, she was coiling, preparing, saving her strike for the moment it would count most. The sixth interruption left the chamber restless, even uncomfortable. Allies shifted uneasily, opponents smirked with expectation. But none could predict the storm gathering just beneath Crockett's composed exterior. She wasn't merely playing defense, she was setting the stage for a counterblow that would not just shut Cruz down but redefine the entire exchange. What happened next would not be remembered as just another hearing exchange buried in the congressional record. It would explode into headlines, hashtags, and history. The line she delivered would echo far beyond the walls of Congress. And all of it hinged on what came after interruption number 7. Ted Cruz did not stumble into this moment by accident. His interruptions in that committee room were not isolated impulses. They were part of a long, predictable pattern that had defined his career for over a decade. To understand the drama that unfolded between him and Jasmine Crockett, you have to peel back the layers of his political persona, the calculated arrogance, the cultivated combativeness, and the relentless hunger to dominate every room he enters. From the earliest days of his rise, Cruz built his reputation on confrontation. At Princeton and later at Harvard Law, he was notorious for arguments that were less about truth and more about winning. Classmates recalled a man who treated every conversation as a debate stage, someone who relished in being the loudest voice in the room. He was brilliant, yes, but brilliance wrapped in an ego that always needed to be fed. That same energy followed him into politics, where the Senate floor became his new battleground. Over time, a pattern emerged. Whether it was shutting down government negotiations with filibusters designed to draw headlines or badgering witnesses during high-profile hearings, Cruz leaned on interruption as his primary weapon. He didn't listen to opponents, he bulldozed them. He didn't invite dialogue, he sought domination. For Cruz, politics was theater, and his role was to play the disruptor who never let his adversaries finish a sentence. This tactic wasn't just about volume, it was about image. Every time Cruz spoke over someone, he reinforced a narrative that he, the seasoned senator, was in control and that others should recognize his authority. To his supporters, it looked like strength. To his critics, it reeked of insecurity masquerading as power. Either way, the interruptions served their purpose, keeping Cruz at the center of the spectacle. But the arrogance wasn't confined to the Senate chamber. Time and again, Cruz had shown a willingness to talk over not just colleagues but the American public itself. During moments of crisis, his instinct was not humility but self-promotion. Who could forget the infamous Cancun incident, when as Texas families sat freezing in the dark during a historic winter storm, Cruz abandoned his constituents for a luxury vacation. The symbolism was striking. When people needed him most, he walked away. And when confronted, he tried to spin the story, talking over the outrage with excuses. It was interruption on a national scale, dismissing the lived suffering of millions with the arrogance of a man convinced he could control the narrative. That arrogance was on full display again in this hearing. Cruz's 6 interruptions weren't spontaneous. They were the well-worn tools of a politician who had spent years turning dialogue into monologue, mistaking bluster for leadership. He wasn't there to weigh the merits of an argument, he was there to suffocate it, to make sure Crockett never had the space to land her truth. And yet, for all his interruptions, for all his carefully sharpened edges, Cruz had also shown cracks in his armor. The louder he grew, the more transparent his strategy became. He had become a caricature of himself, a man so desperate to win the performance that he often lost the substance. Each time he leaned forward to cut someone off, you could see the insecurity bubbling beneath the bravado, the fear of losing control to a rising generation of voices he could no longer silence. This was what made his clash with Crockett so electrifying. She was not the kind of opponent Cruz was used to. He had spent years steamrolling witnesses who wilted under pressure, colleagues who gave way to his interruptions, or audiences too jaded to push back. But Crockett was different. She represented a shift in American politics, a younger, sharper, more diverse generation that refused to yield to the old tactics. Cruz's pattern of arrogance had worked for him in the past. It had kept him relevant, ensured he was quoted, kept his name trending on social med. The chamber fell into a silence that wasn't silence at all. It was charged, expectant, the air vibrating with the weight of what was about to follow. The interruptions had escalated to their peak, and with them the audience's hunger for resolution had reached its highest point. Everyone in the room, reporters, colleagues, even Cruz himself, sensed that the tension could not stretch further without snapping. Crockett's patience had run its course, but not in anger. She wasn't rattled, wasn't defeated. Instead, she was composed, calculating, a fighter who knew that one perfectly placed strike was worth more than 100 wild swings. The fire in her eyes wasn't rage, it was resolve. And as Cruz's voice echoed through the chamber for the 7th time, the moment arrived. Crockett adjusted her microphone, lifted her chin, and prepared to unleash the line that would end the performance. The escalation was complete, the chamber braced for impact. The 7th interruption came like a hammer, heavy and blunt, landing in the middle of Crockett's sentence with all the subtlety of a door slammed in someone's face. Cruz leaned forward, voice booming, hands gesturing like an actor desperate to keep the spotlight. He thought he had seized control once again, that his familiar tactic of drowning out the opposition had worked. But in that moment, as his words cut through the air, something shifted. Crockett did not flinch, she did not roll her eyes, nor did she plead with the chair to intervene. Instead, she let the silence stretch. Cruz's words collided with the stillness, bouncing uselessly in the void. The room noticed. A hush fell, a collective awareness that something more was about to happen. Then Crockett leaned into her microphone, calm and deliberate. Her voice was steady, her tone sharp without raising in volume. "Senator, if you're so afraid of what I have to say that you have to interrupt me 7 times, then maybe it isn't my words you fear, it's the truth behind them." The chamber froze. It was not just a rebuttal. It was a scalpel slicing through the theatrics, exposing the insecurity behind Cruz's bluster. For a moment, the great interrupter was interrupted not by volume but by clarity. His face stiffened, caught between outrage and disbelief. His lips parted as though to fire back, but nothing came. His performance, so carefully constructed, collapsed under the weight of her precision. Crockett didn't stop there. She pressed forward, her cadence deliberate, the room hanging on every syllable. "You can talk over me all you want, you can try to silence me just as people like me have been silenced in this chamber for generations. But the fact remains, I am here, I earned this seat, and no amount of interruption will erase the voices I carry with me." Her words reverberated with more power than volume could ever muster. Cruz shifted in his chair, the practiced confidence draining as cameras zoomed in on his reaction. He had faced critics before, had sparred with colleagues, but few had turned his own weapon against him so effectively. By nomming his interruptions for what they were, fear, Crockett had flipped the entire dynamic. The silence that followed was electric. Even the gavel-wielding chair hesitated, unwilling to break the moment. It was as though the chamber itself understood that history was unfolding in those few seconds of stillness. Crockett continued, her voice steady, her words weighted with purpose. "Every time you cut me off, you prove my point, you prove that what I have to say matters enough to scare you, and I promise you this, I will not be silenced, not by you, not by anyone." It was a masterclass in composure. She hadn't matched Cruz's volume, nor had she descended into chaos. Instead, she weaponized patience, allowing each interruption to set the stage for this devastating counterattack. She had waited for the perfect moment, and when it came, she struck with precision, delivering a line that would live far beyond the committee's record. The audience reaction was immediate. Staffers lowered their heads, hiding the smirks tugging at their lips. Reporters scribbled furiously, knowing the clip would dominate the news cycle. Even Cruz's allies shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that his usual tactic had backfired spectacularly. Cruz opened his mouth, trying to regain footing, but his words faltered. He sputtered, attempted to redirect, but the spell was broken. The chamber had seen him silenced not by force but by truth. The great interrupter had been shut down by the very person he sought to diminish. And Crockett wasn't finished. She leaned back slightly, her poise unshaken. "You've had your stage, Senator, now respectfully it's time you listened." The line landed like a thunderclap. It wasn't just Cruz being called out, it was every politician who had ever used arrogance as a shield, every figure who mistook power for the right to silence others. Crockett had turned the exchange into something bigger, a moment that spoke to everyone who had ever been dismissed or interrupted in their own lives. The emotional resonance was palpable. Viewers watching at home felt it in their bones, the vindication, the sense of finally seeing arrogance confronted and dignity prevail. Social media was already ablaze, the clip circulating with captions that captured the essence: "Crockett shuts Cruz down." Cruz tried once more to interrupt, but the momentum had shifted irreversibly. Each attempt felt weaker, less certain, like a man trying to reclaim ground that was already gone. His face betrayed him, tightened jaw, narrowed eyes, a forced half-smile masking the sting of humiliation. Crockett, meanwhile, exuded calm triumph. She had not shouted, she had not begged, she had simply held her ground until the weight of her truth crushed the performance before her. It was the kind of moment that transcended politics, the kind of moment destined for replay, for memes, for hashtags. And beneath it all was the unspoken truth: Cruz's weapon of interruption had failed him. He had overplayed his hand, and in doing so had handed Crockett the perfect opportunity to deliver a blow that would define the hearing. The chamber sat in that charged silence, the air heavy with the realization of what had just occurred. Cruz shifted again, but it was too late. Crockett had claimed the stage, and no amount of volume could take it back. What began as a clash of personalities had now transformed into a lesson. "Arrogance can interrupt, but dignity endures." And in this exchange, dignity had spoken louder than arrogance ever could. The aftermath of this moment would stretch far beyond the walls of Congress. It would ripple across news outlets, trend on social media, and ignite conversations about power, respect, and the silencing of voices. But for now, in this chamber, the silence said it all. And as the cameras captured Cruz's quiet retreat into himself and Crockett's unflinching resolve, one question lingered in the minds of everyone watching. If this single line could silence a senator, what would its echoes do to the nation? The moment Jasmine Crockett delivered her line, the room seemed to fracture into two timelines. The official business of the hearing trudging forward in one and the viral aftershocks exploding outside those walls in another. What happened inside the chamber was significant, but what happened after, how it spread, how it resonated, how it ignited a movement of validation, was what truly made it historic. Within minutes, clips of the exchange hit social media. A staffer's phone lit up first, then a journalist tweeted a snippet, and from there it was unstoppable. The video spread like wildfire across platforms, Twitter timelines flooded with Crockett's mic drop moment. Instagram Reels replayed the silence that followed her words. TikTok users layered the clip with music, captions, and celebratory reactions. The phrase, "afraid of the truth," trended within the hour. Memes bloomed. One showed Cruz drowning in a sea of Crockett's quotes. Another stitched his interruptions into a loop, ending with her calm takedown like a knockout punch in a prize fight. Hashtags surged. Crockett shuts him down, dignity wins, seventh interruption. Every scroll was another validation for viewers who had long felt voiceless. Commentators jumped in quickly. Progressive talk shows praised Crockett's poise, describing her as the future of politics and a masterclass in dignity under fire. Even some centrist voices, usually cautious in their praise, admitted she had turned the tables with surgical precision. Editorials framed the moment as more than just congressional drama. They called it a parable about respect, power, and who truly owns the floor in America. But it wasn't only pundits. Ordinary people latched onto the moment as though it were their own. Teachers commented that they had felt silenced in classrooms. Women in corporate America shared stories of being talked over in meetings. Immigrants wrote that they saw themselves in Crockett's insistence on being heard. The resonance wasn't abstract, it was deeply personal. Crockett's words became a rallying cry for anyone who had ever been interrupted into invisibility. Celebrities added fuel to the fire. A-list actors tweeted support, musicians reshared the clip with emojis of raised fists and flames. Late-night hosts worked it into their monologues, replaying the exchange with laughter at Cruz's stunned expression. On podcasts, activists dissected the line, calling it a model for how to reclaim power without losing composure. Crockett's moment transcended the political echo chamber. It became cultural currency. Meanwhile, Cruz faced the other side of the shockwaves. His interruptions, usually forgotten as background noise in the churn of politics, were now under a microscope. Commentators replayed them in sequence, pointing out the bullying cadence, the desperate,